Okay, if everybody could come in and take their seats, because we're about to get started, and sit in the front seats. Look, there's 3 seats there. Somebody come and sit in them.
Well, welcome everyone for the 53rd in the We ALBA Book special meetings round Scotland. And what better place to come than here in Arbroath, where 723 years ago, a very famous declaration was made. So what better place tonight than here in Arbroath for another declaration?
event here in Arbroath, and we convene, and I'm going to get the numbers right first time round, after 703 years of the Declaration of Arbroath, and we're still campaigning, and we're still yes, and we're still working for independence. Now, tonight's a really, really special meeting because tonight, along with Alex, we have Jim Sillars, and I was looking back at when I was last at an event with Jim Sillars, and indeed when Alex was last at an event with Jim, and looking back at my phones, and I came up with a picture, Jim. 10th of September 2014 it was, a beautiful sunny day at the Pleasance in Edinburgh, when the entirety of representatives of the Yes Group, Yes Scotland, and all of the Yes groupings in the lead up to the referendum were in the Pleasance in Edinburgh. And we're in front of the Margot Mobile. Jim, you may remember that beautiful day. And what a time it was. It was the SNP, the Greens, Say Yes Scotland, all of the independence movements, the SSP, everybody was there, and what a time it was. And those times must come again. Now, before we start the meeting, I must first of all say hello and welcome to everyone watching us on Indie Live, and say a special shout out, as I always do, to Gary and Stuart, who are here unfailingly always to film what we're doing today, so everybody can watch us online. And also a very special shout out to Kevin Gibney from all of us and his family. You'll know why I'm saying that, but can I just say to you all, without Indie Live, we wouldn't be able to get the message across. So please support Indie Live and all the work that they do, because they're currently fundraising. Now, as we know, it's quite a torrid time in Scottish politics. And over the past week, though the unionists have been rubbing their hands, I would say that without any good cause, but Lord David Frost said just this week that ministers should make clear, he said, that if re-elected, they will review and roll back some of the currently devolved powers. Well, if unionists think they can use elections to roll back on devolved powers, nationalists know that we will use forthcoming elections to roll forward on independence. And we've also had Douglas Ross, who managed to find some time from refereeing on the football pitch to say that Scottish Tories are suggesting that voters would tactically back Labour to oust the nationalists. Well, if unionists can unite in elections, as they have done so and will continue to do, to keep the nationalists out, then the nationalists can unite, must unite, as one, as Scotland United, to win across the board at the next election and use that win to negotiate independence, because there is simply no reason, no excuse not to. The independence movement expects nothing else from us, and we must deliver. And in that spirit, we are here tonight. In fact, in that spirit, Jim and Alex are sharing a platform tonight. And of course, they share a history, a former deputy leader and a former leader of a once truly, truly great party, the envy of all political parties in Scotland and far beyond, for its competence and its desire to ensure that independence is secured. So they share a platform since 2014 because the calling now, right now, is so great, so urgent, and so necessary. And action is required this very day. Let there be no mistake. So with that in mind, please join me in welcoming to our 53rd We ALBA book event, the most excellent Jim Sillars.
The reason I'm here tonight is to give the movement some advice, and I think Alex is likely to do the same. Not in a party way, but about the movement. And I think Alex and I are entitled to say that we have advice to give, because we went through the period when to be a member of the SNP at that time was a matter of mockery on the part of most people in Scotland. When I joined the SNP in 1980, they had just been gubbed in the local elections. And a chap I got on well with in the Labour Party in Glasgow said to me, "What the hell have you joined the SNP for?" He said, "You have an unerring eye for jumping on to a sinking ship." And that's how it looked. We went through periods when we were only 12% in the poll. It took until 92 to jump from 17 to 21%. We've been through periods when not only patience, but belief and stamina, political stamina, was required. And this is one of those periods once again. There's a number of people who became active in this movement because of their experience in 2014. And they have never experienced anything but winning. Well, that might not be the case immediately this year. So I'm saying to them, you've got to look at what happened in the past when we had the patience and we had the stamina to see ourselves through very, very difficult periods. Now, I read the Tory press, always have done, and that's a piece of advice, particularly to the young ones. Always try and understand where your opponents are coming from. That way, you'll be better able to tackle your opponents. And there is no question that for the unionist press and the unionist politicians, this past month has been Christmas every day. And they all think the game's up. Independence, it's finished. The further south you go, the more certain they are that independence is finished. Well, I wish they were at this meeting tonight, because they're wrong. This movement has no intention of packing up its tents and slinking off the political battlefield. We are not in retreat. We are in a position where, I'll explain later, we can actually advance. And why are we not going to pack up and leave the political battlefield? Why, despite what is now a daily horror show, why is it still between 45 and 48% in favour of independence? Well, there's two reasons for that. First is, the Scottish National Party is not the independence movement, full stop. It is a component of it. It's a component, a valuable component, but it is not the independence movement. And the second reason that we've got 45 to 48% is that from hard experience, they know that Scotland must escape from being handcuffed to the declining, failing British state. We've got to get out of the handcuffs if our people are to reach a level of security and prosperity and live in a decent society. In the real world, outside the deep trench of trouble that my party is in at the present time, a clear analysis shows that this is actually a golden moment of opportunity for the independence movement. That's the tragedy of the present time. We're being deflected away from what is a golden moment of opportunity, because it's essential for our people to understand that we have to escape from the failing British state. Now, go back to 2014. The Unionist case in 2014 was that for Scotland and its people to survive, we had to shelter under the umbrella of the beneficent, large, powerful United Kingdom economy. That falsehood is being revealed every single day. It wasn't true then. People believed it. There is now no reason, if they look at the state of the British state with clear, objective eyes, there is no reason to believe that 2014 was true because it was false. That was the Unionist case. I said, I read the Tory press. Daily Telegraph last month, headline on top of one of their main columnist articles. And I quote, "The UK is a poor country pretending to be rich. The British state is living on an international credit card." The big buzzword that describes the British state today isn't growth, it's debt. That describes it. Now, this is nothing new, actually. This is a personal point of view, but I think it's fairly accurate. What we are seeing is the final decline of the post-imperial British state. It has been in decline and crises ever since 1945. I know that because I've lived through every single one of those crises. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, that was a major blow, followed very shortly by the mishandling of the pandemic. Two major blows to the declining British state have accelerated that decline. And what Tom Nairn, a great theorist in the socialist movement, was Tom. Tom argued years ago what is now unfolding in front of our eyes. The institutions of the British state are crumbling. What holds up a state are its institutions and the strengths of them. Look at the British state institutions. Monarchy besmirched. The recent poll shows that a majority of the people, not just in Scotland, but south of the border, couldn't care less about the coronation. Parliament is no longer an exemplar of good government. Its armed forces are now reduced to a size that couldn't defend Cornwall, never the rest of the British Isles. The Bank of England is now a repository for failed economists. The Church of England is another pillar and institution of the British state, is in theological crises. The National Health Service no longer able to deliver as it used to. A civil service that no longer functions. Nothing that matters to people in the British state, whether it's a small matter like mending a pothole or getting your passport or getting into the NHS, now works in the British state. And that's what we have to get across to those who still haven't come down the road with us towards independence. If we are to escape from the British state's decline, if we don't escape, we will decline along with them, and we will continue to live in an economy in which food banks are the main engine of growth in our economy. Every rational Scot should be asked to very carefully consider the state of the British state and ask themselves, is it really in the interest of you, your family, and your community to remain handcuffed to that state, to decline along with it, or isn't it preferable and more sensible to escape from it and use our resources to build a better society here in Scotland? This movement has said for a long time now that we need a national organisation. It's time for the movement to think very carefully where we've been and why we are in the position we are today. Because the movement gave monopolistic power to one single political party, tied our fate, apparently, to one single political party. We cannot be, and we cannot allow ourselves to be damaged because that political party of which I am a member is damaged. The movement matters more than any political party or individual. This requires decisive action as a movement as distinct from parties. We've learned, or we should have learnt, a bitter lesson. Never again must we ally ourselves with one single party. The movement has to become unambiguously autonomous, with its own United for Independence national organisation. A reconstruction of that all-embracing organisation that took us in a magnificent campaign in 2014 from 29% in February to 45% on the eve of poll. We've got to reconstruct that model because it was successful. Now, there's nothing new in what I'm saying. From all over the movement, we hear the cry for a single organisation. Davy was talking to me in the car, bringing me to the station, about folk meeting in Edinburgh to talk again about creating a single organisation. All over our movement, people have been doing their own thing. The movement splintered at the present time. I've talked to groups who are working on a written constitution, who are working on our relationship with Europe, either the EFTA or the EU, working on foreign policy. None of us are talking to each other. We're all doing our own thing. We're not submitting our ideas and policy to other folk to criticise in terms of discussion and debate. There is no coherence. We couldn't go out tonight in Chapadoa and say, here is a body of policy we want you to support. So we need to do it. So with lots of talk, we need to bring everybody and their ideas together. Now, I have deliberately spoken about the movement, not parties, because the movement is the priority right now. Parties as electoral instruments will resume their importance in due course. But the priority for us now is for the movement to do the work that hasn't been done for the last 6 years by the party of which I am a member. It isn't that the cupboard of policy is actually blank. There's policies, as I say, all over the place. But before we can bring them together, before we can present a coherent economic and social policy to the people of Scotland, then we all have to sit down under the one single umbrella of a national organisation. And I can think of no better place than Glasgow Green, and no better day than the 6th of May at that demonstration for us to actually take the decision from that day on to create the national organisation we must have.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. Now, on our way up here from Glasgow earlier today, we stopped off to use one of the wonderful facilities in Dundee. And just as we were walking in, myself and Alex, another chap was walking in his work gear and a bag, clearly to use the gym. So he said, "Oh, Alec, will you join me? Are you coming to join me for a workout?" I laughed out loud a bit rudely, actually. But Alex said, "No, but I'm slimming," which he is. I'm slimming. But the reason I make the point is because he gave us his card, and by the way, he's got plastering and rough casting services. He obviously thinks something needs fixing in the movement. That's what he does. MPS, great guy. But I make the point because what he said as he went in to do his workout is, "Alex, when are you coming back? Please say you're coming back. We need you to come back." And with that, I'll say he never left, never stopped fighting. We'll keep fighting. Please join me in welcoming Alex Salmond.
Well, I should have said to the lad from Dundee, I'm slimming slowly, you know. I'm taking it gradually, not trying to rush it, you know. I was listening to Jim, and Tasmina reminded us that we spoke in that glorious summer of 2014 in the run-up to the last few days of the referendum, where everything seemed possible. But actually, in terms of an indoor meeting, because that was an outdoor meeting, it was so big, you know, but in terms of an indoor meeting, the last time Jim and I actually spoke on a platform was the Govan by-election of November the 10th, 1988. And it was a highly significant by-election. It was a seminal moment in Scottish politics, not just because of Jim's victory over the Labour Party. It was a moment in that by-election. For those of in the audience who are too young to remember, it was a huge Labour majority. It was Glasgow Govan, a very symbolic place. Margaret MacDonald, of course, had won a by-election there in 1973. So it resonated in the history of the national movement, and Jim Sillars was the candidate, and I was fortunate enough to be the campaign manager, or Supremo was the vice convener, senior vice convener, I think what it was. The SNP made up that these days, for the lack of money you got for the title that you were given. So you were senior. Anyway, we're doing the by-election. It was coming down to a big debate. The Labour candidate was Bob Gillespie, who died just a few days ago. Fine man, trade unionist, great record of service to the Labour movement. But no match in the by-election for Mr. Sillars. And it came to a head-off in this STV debate. Bernard Ponsonby, incidentally, was the Liberal candidate in the Govan by-election. So he wasn't the chairman, he was part of the debate. But Jim and Bob were daggers drawn, obviously. And Bob had obviously been rehearsed, and every single thing he could possibly be asked in the cross-question by Jim Sillars. So I've got no doubt that they spent weeks in the back room training Bob. He's going to argue about independence or oil or revenue to Scotland or Labour not delivering on devolution. Could be a range of things. And Jim looked at Bob Gillespie and said to him, "Bob, what's your opinion on the European policy of additionality?" And you can see Bob thinking back to his old grade arithmetic. And at that moment, what demonstrated in the election is that the SNP, because additionality was the process by which you got added on grants by European investment into areas like Govan, which badly needed it. It was the SNP who were thinking in a canvas beyond the immediacy of the by-election to the benefit of Scotland, and the Labour Party basically had people who couldn't think beyond the Labour getting another seat to add to the feeble 50 that they already had in Westminster. And the point about Govan was this. The SNP had been in business for about 60 years before the Govan by-election. 60 years. And although they'd had the occasional success here and there, for these 60 years, basically, the Westminster establishment laughed at Scottish nationalism. It was idiosyncratic. They might have the odd kilted victory from time to time, but basically it was an object of fun and humour and not something to be taken seriously. After Govan, the laughing stopped. Now, I say this to you tonight because I've been looking over the last couple of days, and the laughing's back. Yesterday, Prime Minister's question, Stephen Flynn asked a perfectly reasonable question about the Labour-Tory alliance, better together, getting back together. You think after the first time round they would say this is the greatest idea in the world, but the Tories telling folk, I vote Labour in the right seats to get rid of the SNP. So we asked a perfectly reasonable question to the Rishi Sunak about that alliance coming back again. And instead of getting a hard political answer, Rishi Sunak says, well, we're just motoring on with our policies. Wasn't it a great joke? Wasn't it a great pun? What was important about it was the laugh. You're not even worth answering now because you're becoming comic once again. Tasmina mentioned Lord David Frost. Just in case any of you have missed the glittering career of Lord David Frost, erstwhile the ambassador to Denmark, chief executive of the Scotch Whisky Association, who had a memorable appearance before a Scottish parliamentary committee and said, I think it was early 2016, that Britain left the European Union, it'd be a disaster for living standards and £1,500 would be taken off the income of each family. Lord David Frost underestimated because he was made the chief Euro negotiator for the United Kingdom, taking on Michel Barnier, a French Gaullist trade who took the pants off him in every part of the negotiation. Lord David Frost is a totally discredited figure. The worst negotiator in history. He's made every family in the United Kingdom substantially poorer by taking a disastrous situation of Brexit and making it a catastrophe for the deal that Johnson signed, the deal that Lord David Frost negotiated. So if we get to a position that even Lord David Frost feels emboldened to say, let's get these Scots back in their box once and for all. Let's use the next election as a means of reversing any powers that they've got, and let's make sure we finish them off. Then it's time for the alarm bells to ring in this movement. Of course, you can use that against them. You can say, they're revealed, they're trying to get us. But behind it is a message that politics is never static. You're either going forwards or you're going backwards. You cannot stand still. And Scotland, after 20 years of going forwards, is now in danger of being taken backwards by people who feel comfortable about ridiculing Scotland and Scottish aspirations once again. So, we're here in Arbroath, and there couldn't be a better place to make the speech that Jim's just made, a memorable speech, about the distinction between the movement and the political parties. Because in the Declaration of Arbroath, obviously famous, everybody here no doubt could recite the most famous lines, 100 of us remain alive, will never submit to the domination of the English, and so on and so forth, ringing words through 703 years of history, and rightly so. Beautifully written by Bernard of Kilwinning, the Chancellor of Scotland. But he wrote it for, and people say, oh, it's a medieval document, it was all the nobles, it was the barons. Yes, of course, there were 7 earls, 31 barons, the freeholders, folk like William Wallace. Wasn't he the king? He was for the king. It was a letter to Pope John the 22nd for good King Robert. And it wasn't the clergy, because they wrote it. So who was it from? Well, it was from all of these people, or for all these people. But there was another phrase in the Declaration of Arbroath. It said the barons, the earls, the freeholders, and the whole community of the realm of Scotland. And that phrase, that community of the realm, was invented in that period and memorably described in the Arbroath Declaration. Because it meant that there was something beyond the established political leadership of the feudal kingdom. And why did they invent that phrase over that period of time? Because at times in the War of Independence, the First War of Independence, the established leadership had let them down. They'd flown the coop. They were in English jails or French jails. They were tomb tabards like John Balliol. They betrayed the country like half of the nobility. Shows you time doesn't change that much, does it? So they had to invent something that was beyond leadership who couldn't be relied upon. And they expressed it as the community of the realm. And what better analogy could there be now for the distinction between the national movement in Scotland and the political party, which has had the leadership of that movement, rightly so, for many, many years. Because when that political party is failing, it's time for the community, the national movement, to come forward to the forefront. So what is to be done? Well, as Jim rightly says, there is a body of work and policy still to be done. The ALBA party over the last year of these 53 meetings have made a fair contribution. I mean, it's a small book. That's why we call it the wee ALBA book. But it has a great deal in it. A great deal of sense. A great deal of the thinking. Jim himself contributed to the policy on Europe by putting forward the EFTA argument. And it's worth just dwelling on that for a second, because it tells you why it's important. Let's just say that everything turned out well, everything was fixed, and let's just say that let's call it the national movement, won the next general election, or the next Scottish elections in 2026. And we got into a negotiating position with, well, let's say Sir Keir Starmer as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I know folk are laughing, and I understand that. I can see the humour in that phraseology. But it's a possibility. And Eva Comrie, sitting there, was the lead negotiator for Scotland, sitting across the table from Keir Starmer. Well, Keir Starmer wouldn't be having a good time, I can tell you. But let's say we came to trading policy. And Keir Starmer said, well, I'm just interested, Eva, in what is your trading policy going to be when we negotiate the independence? And Eva wanted to say, but she was taking the established SNP position at the present moment, well, in 5 years' time, we are very confident we'll join the European Union. And Sir Keir Starmer, who's not dynamite on his feet, would probably have the wit to say, but what's going to happen in 5 weeks' time, Eva, when we settle this agreement? And if it was the SNP established policy, answer would there be none. Because you can't get into the European Union in 5 weeks, or even 5 months. It does take 5 years. Even if Michel Barnier was negotiating our side and Lord Frost was on their side, 5 years is the best you could do. But you can get into EFTA in 3 months. And you can inherit the treaties of EFTA, and you get a passport into the single market. And you know you're going to get there. So EVA, instead of saying we're going to join the European Union in 5 years, would say, well, actually, we've already got our application for EFTA in. We've been assured it's going to be accepted. We're going to be in the single market, and we'd like to negotiate something similar with the rest of the UK, as is in the Windsor House Agreement with Northern Ireland at the present moment. Game, set, match to EVA. That's why you have to think before you act. You have to be prepared for negotiation. You have to put yourself in the position of success. Because the thing that happened after the Govan by-election is that the national movement and the SNP, after 60 years of assuming they were not going to succeed, they were going to try manfully and womanly. They were going to do their absolute best. They were going to do their best for Scotland, but they didn't actually think they were going to win. After Govan, we started to think we were going to win. And if you think like winners, you've got to prepare to be winners. And you've got to prepare for that point of negotiation. So that would be the European policy, in my estimation, which the movement has to crystallise in a way that the party of government hasn't managed to advance over the last few years. There's other huge issues, huge opportunities as well as huge difficulties. Offshore wind, the incredible bounty, the reality that we are within touching distance of producing 5 times the electricity that we need from Scottish continental waters, the Scottish economic zone, and we're in touching distance of that. And when I was canvassing recently in the Dice by-election in Aberdeen, a woman came to the door on a Saturday afternoon. I said, look, I'm sorry, madam, I didn't mean to disturb you because you're on your way out. She says, I'm not on my way out. I wear my coat because I can't afford to turn the heating on in the energy capital of Europe. That's the reality where we are, but the potential and opportunity is what we've got to do. And you can't say to the folk, look, we're going to have a renewable energy boom and a just transition, if they're going to look at you and say, well, what happened to the last boom? And where was ours over these last 50 years of oil and gas bounty? You have to be able to say, well, we've learned a lesson or two. We've looked across the North Sea. We've seen a small country become one of the richest countries on earth because they decided to control the resource as opposed to allowing international capital to control them. They took a share in every field. They built up their own companies. They made sure that their own industry and their own workers benefited from the energy surge. And unless we can look people in the eye and say we've planned that for the new renewable boom, they'll say to us, away you go. We're not going to get sold out again. You have to do the work, not the disgrace of the ScotWind auction of 1 year ago, when the Scottish Government were jumping up and down. They were getting 700 million in total for leasing assets that were worth at least 10 times that in a renewable basis. We need the public energy company that somehow became so difficult to deliver, not being a distribution company like many others, but having ownership as of right of the offshore energy renewable fields, a percentage of every field, as the Norwegians did so long ago with oil and gas. You have to do the work if you're going to inspire people to vote to claim their future. So Jim is correct. Now, I don't know if you even, there's so many acronyms that I've lost count. You know, there's the SSR, I like them all, don't get me wrong. There's SSRG, and there's Salvo, and there's the various ones, and there's Commonweal, which does such wonderful work, and there's the various political parties. I remember ALBA, of course, you know, it's, because I lead it, but, you know, there's so many. And it's not necessary to say to everybody, well, you know, to just subsume what you've done. But we have to coordinate, and there has to be a national coordinating aspect to it to make sure that the work that's being done can be applied, as Jim rightly says, to make sure the movement has the prospectus that hasn't been supplied from elsewhere, that the community of the realm have stepped in to supply and fill the vacuum of the established leadership. And that, I would submit, is something that requires to be done. It's not what is to be done, this must be done. And it must be done quickly. And all of us who believe in that and believe it's worth doing are going to have to just subsume a little bit for the greater good of establishing that national movement, coordinated, to make sure that Scotland doesn't become a laughingstock once again. And lastly, I've got to say this, that while that work is being done, while the movement is asserting itself and recognizing the achievement that it supplied to get to the high 40s in the polls for independence, and the opportunity to turn that into much more, if the inspiration as well as the perspiration is there to produce the programme that will inspire the people, there will be elections. And I believe now, because unfortunately the referendum strategy has rather been compromised, let's put it no further than that, by the actions or inactions of the Scottish Government over these last few years, that you have to look at the elections we know that are going to happen. And we have to look at them in a context where the SNP brand may not be outstanding in terms of public appreciation. I choose my words as carefully as I can. But the cause and the opportunity to vote credibly for independence must be there at each and every election in each and every constituency in the land. You have to supply the chance for people to vote themselves into freedom. Now, back in 1992, when I was leader and Jim was my deputy, we came up with a phrase to offer to the people in the 92 election. We decided, okay, you know, we know we might not win the election, but we've got to offer people the opportunity to win the election. And we started, as Jim rightly says, we had, I think, 14% in the previous election, perhaps 70%. We said, what can we do to transform our prospects? So we said, right, we'll appeal for a mandate to negotiate. Yeah, we didn't get it, but we propelled the independence vote forward, falling on from government. An election actually fought an independence, which was a great building block for the future. Now we have a transformed situation. When we say we are seeking a mandate to negotiate, we've actually got an institution in the Scottish Parliament that can do the negotiations on our side. Although they'd be very wise to ask Eva Comrie to lead, in my opinion. So, it becomes a credible option to seek a mandate to negotiate at each and every election, including the one that's going to happen next year, the one that Keir Starmer is licking his lips and saying we're going to see off the SNP in Scotland. Let's answer with the community of the realm. Let's answer with a candidate in each constituency, standing for their party certainly, but also carrying the name of Scotland United or Scottish Independence or whatever label we want to say, as a candidate who says, I am standing in this constituency with my colleagues across the country. We are seeking a mandate to negotiate independence and freedom of our country. And not only will that inspire the people, the ghosts of the past, The people who sealed that declaration in Arbroath will be cheering us on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both Jim and Alex. We now move to questions. I have some written questions. Once we get through them, then we'll move to questions from the floor. I think I'm right in saying we've got till 9:30 with a lovely voice from Indie Live. So we've got a good 45 minutes to get into some questions. The first question I've got is from Joyce Anderson. Joyce, I know you want me to read the question, but where are you? You're here? You're there. Right. Thank you, Joyce. So Joyce's question is, any chance you can step in now, since Nicola's left, and get our independence and correct this utter mess we are in, as you're the man to get things done proper? Now, Joyce hasn't detailed who the question is for, so presumably Joyce would be happy with any of these men to my left or my right, or even myself. But you said man, so we'll stick with either Jim or Alex. Jim, I'm going to come to you first. How do we fix the mess, and would you step in to do it?
Well, I'm just a wee bit old now. I'm on my last lap, as it were. But I'll tell you what I think is required. I've said we need stamina and patience. We also need to apply some critical common sense to ourselves. If we have to go from 45 to 55, and I'll explain why I'm talking about 55, then we have to persuade people who don't agree with us to come with us. And I don't see how we're going to do that if you walk up to somebody and say, "See you, you traitorous bastard. By the way," by the way, I'd like to talk to you about independence. I think it's very important that we see our fellow citizens as opponents and not enemies, and that we try to understand why it is that they still believe in the Union. Now, it is actually perfectly understandable. After 315 or many years it is now, fought wars together, created an empire together, British trade union movement created, and actually there'll still be a British trade union movement when we're independent. My Union Unite operates north and south of Ireland, as well as England and Scotland and Wales. So you can understand why people still believe in the Union. Respect them for that. That's a legitimate position from their point of view. And once you accept, or you say to them, "You're perfectly legitimate, but you're wrong," and I'll explain to you why you're wrong. You believed in something that actually is no longer there and hasn't been there for a long time, then we have a reasonable chance of winning them over. And by the way, going from 45 to a winning position isn't the scoosh that I heard one SNP MP believe it was. It's like climbing Mount Everest. That last wee bit is the hardest of all. So we're at the hardest bit. But we shouldn't be satisfied by trying to get to 50 plus 1. And I'll tell you why. I would like us to go up to 55, 56, 57, 58. And there are reasons for that. First of all, you get a victory of that magnitude, there is no question about it. And don't forget, the SNP gave hostages to fortune over Brexit when they demanded a second vote. I remember phoning Ian Blackford and saying, "Are you off your head?" The Unionists have piled that away. But if you're away up there, 55 and above, there can't be any arguments. Secondly, you have to think beyond independence. If we're going to make Scotland independent a success, then those who lose on that vital day have got to acquiesce in the decision and got to join in making Scotland a success. We don't want to end up 51 wanting it and 49 wanting it to fail. So you've got to raise our game well above 50 plus 1. We need a degree of statesmanship, not just from the leaders. We need a degree of statesmanship from every single member of this movement. No abuse, talk to folk. Go for that very high level, because once we're there, then we can start to make... I don't want independence because I want to see the saltire flying. I want independence. I come from the working class. All of my life, we've been insecure. Always worried, because in a capitalist society, we have to sell our labour to live. And the labour market is determined by forces. I want an independent Scotland to be in charge of those forces, so that the working class that I come from can have the security they've never had, their children can have the opportunities lots of them have never had. That's the aim of independence. Not just arguing we want to be free. Of course we do. It's the reason we want to be free that really matters. I got into a lot of trouble over the last few years when everybody's marching up and down the country. I said, stop marching and start thinking. And one of the things Alex said was, think. We've a huge amount of thinking to do, and then once we've thought and sorted it out, then we can go campaigning. There hasn't been an independence campaign at street level since 2014. That's a problem. We have to gear up now. Alex, right? We've got to have this national organisation, this coherence, and we have to have a programme of campaigning. We won't win the election on social media. We'll win the election by meeting folk at their doorways and in their workplaces and telling them the kind of Scotland that we have in our vision. You just compare 2014 with just now. 2014 was a wonderful experience in Scotland. We were alive with ideas and belief. We are flat as a pancake at the present time. We have to gear up, organise, gear up, and get out there campaigning. That's the only way we're going to do it.
Alex, over to you. You said you were slimming slowly. Does that mean you're getting fit for it?
Yes, very quickly indeed. The three aspects, right? One, in terms of the ingredients of success. One is the Scottish Government. Now, only the SNP can do this. Hamza Yousaf has to sort out the Scottish Government. Back in 2014, many things were said about independence for Scotland, and many attacks were made upon it. One thing that was never said was the Scottish Government and its performance and its record was a liability to the independence campaign, because we'd made sure they couldn't be said because of the things that had been done between 2007 and 2014. I with Tasmina, did a debate recently at the Oxford Union. Very interesting. On the Daily Telegraph dictum of Jim Sillars, let's put it that way. Incidentally, we got over a third of the vote, which I thought was something of a triumph. But it was very interesting. The speeches against independence. Young, middle-class Scots, many of whom couldn't have got into Edinburgh University, even with 6 A's at higher, and thought that was a dreadful thing. And they were right, incidentally, to think it was a dreadful thing. I mean, they'd done not too bad landing on their feet at Oxford, incidentally, but nonetheless, every speech that was made against independence in that debate from articulate, young, intelligent young Scots at Oxford wasn't about independence, it was about the record of the SNP government. I'd done this, I'd done that, hadn't they done that, hadn't they done the ferries, etc., etc., etc. You have to sort out. Now, there's some things in the melee of the last few days, there's been some hopeful signs. At least they're stopping doing disastrous things, or some of them at least. There's some things that haven't been so helpful, incidentally, but not doing the bottle return scheme. That was another ferries disaster waiting to happen, except there's more of it to come. So not doing that is a really good idea. But you can't run the country just by not doing things. The test is doing things. And Hamza Yousaf has got a big job on to sort out the Scottish Government, to make it an advantage to the independence cause once again, as opposed to an albatross around its neck. Secondly, the work on policy. That is where the Scottish Convention is, Independence Convention, bringing together the groups. The intellectual firepower is there. I've read brilliant analysis on the Scottish currency, on the claim of right, on how to handle the offshore resource from all these groups. There's no problem with intellectual firepower. It's getting it together and getting it coherent and moulding it into not necessarily an individual political party's programme. ALBA has a programme, but something that the movement can rejoice in as the strengths of policy formulation and showing something of the ambition that we can have for our people. Because you'll never win a revolution without rising expectations, without pointing people to a vision of why it's all going to be worthwhile. And thirdly, the thing that might be the trickiest, you've got to get together an electoral alliance in order to progress this. And that electoral alliance can't be 100% one party. That's not an alliance. It has to be give and take. But right now, it would be important not to neglect that the looming setback of next year could be turned into an opportunity. Why? There's 50 years ago, there was a book written by Douglas Hurd, the former Foreign Secretary, and Andrew Osmond, called Scotch in the Rocks. Right, some of you are old enough to remember. It was only ever shown once on BBC television, at a time when BBC thought it might be interesting to invest in Scottish drama. They showed Scotch in the Rocks over, I think, 4, perhaps even 5 episodes. And some of the great Scottish actors of the day, Ian Cuthbertson and John Kearney, were in it. I think Taggart was in it as a very young man as well. It was great. And I watched it. I was at school and I thought, brilliant. The SNP were a bit disgruntled about it because it had an aspect to the plot was about a Scottish Liberation Army. And of course, even though the SNP were portrayed as a highly respectable constitutional outfit, which of course they are and were, they thought this whole thing was a bit dangerous and threatened an interdict, and the BBC agreed never to show it again. Actually, of course, for a young Scot, it made this dream, this imagination very real indeed. And actually was a huge boost to the SNP going into the 74 campaign. But anyway, the point about I was going to make is this. In the first chapter of Scotch in the Rocks, it's set in what was then the North British, now the Balmoral Hotel in Edinburgh. And two of the lead characters, the boy who's the putative leader of the Scottish Liberation Army, but that's a secret at the time, is talking to the leader of the SNP, a guy called Henderson, a very respectable guy, a bit like myself, a very respectable sort of guy. And the rest of the SNP contingent are about to fling themselves out the window because they'd only gone from 6 seats to 34 seats. And they were fixated in getting 36 seats, a majority in preceding independence, and oh my goodness, they'd fallen just short. So they were in an awful state. And the revolutionary guy, who I think was standing for governor, if I remember right in the book, goes up to the SNP leader and says, for goodness sake, say something to these idiots. Let them know what's actually happening. And the SNP leader says, friends, we've fallen just short of our target of 36 seats, but have you had a look at what's happened south of the border? where the two parties are neck and neck. They're in balance. We have the balance and we have the power. You could possibly, it's not certain because that's a very difficult calculation, arrive at a situation where even though you could go backwards in terms of MPs, but forwards in terms of influence and power. And that's why it's important not to allow that election to go by default. Perhaps to try and present the independence case, which is so strong, in addition to the SNP case, which could be a lot stronger than it is at the present moment. It might become an opportunity, and political opportunities have to be seized, but you have to be ready. And incidentally, you have to know how to handle the balance of power. Otherwise, you end up like Nick Clegg, you know, very rich, but in America. So these are the things you prepare for, and that's why the electoral things. So the three things that are necessary, beyond individual personalities, much more important. Sort out the Scottish Government, get together an independence convention, and find an electoral way for independence and independent supporters to fight the election with a chance of winning.
Next question is from George Walls. Thank you, George, for your question. I asked the question. Jim, I'm going to pose this to you first, because obviously you're still a member of the SNP. Is there any chance of a reconciliation with the SNP and the Yes Movement? Interesting, because the question obviously sees the SNP and the Yes Movement being separate and distinct. So is there a chance of a reconciliation with the SNP and the Yes Movement in general to bring the Yes Movement closer together? Jim?
Well, we've got to look at the present situation from an SNP party member's position. It is not good, and it could get worse. And I've been on television several times, and the point I've made isn't about trying to get a reconciliation just now, it's trying to get a separation, because I don't want the movement to be damaged. I mean, when you read the English papers, they think everything up here, independent, has been seriously damaged because they think the SNP is the independence movement. Take care of the SNP from their point of view and you fix the independence movement, we'll never hear from them again. So the priority for us at the present time is to make the movement autonomous, that it's recognised in its own right, that it's not tarred by an SNP brush. That's our priority from now right through next year as we try to construct a national organisation that can actually fight elections. Not as a political party, but as Alex said, you might have an amalgamation of people, an alliance of people who actually fight it. So I don't see any rehabilitation at the present time. One of the reasons I've stayed in the SNP, people have said to me, why are you still there? And I've said in the past, because there'll have to be a reconciliation between the SNP and ALBA. We cannot have forever a divided independence movement in respect of political parties. I don't see how we can do that. And I have stayed in the SNP. I'm on the fringes of it as far as influence is concerned, but the time might come when I might have some influence and say, look, we can't have this. There has to be an accommodation with ALBA. It's not a fringe organisation like the Greens that you take into coalition that you can dispense with. But that is not the present position. And if there's any reconciliation between the SNP and the independence movement, any rehabilitation, then it has to come from the SNP. A bit of humility on the part of the leadership of my party in the future might go a long way to that rehabilitation and reconciliation. The bigger than any of the political parties. That's the key thing. And I keep using the word autonomy. It has to be seen as the autonomous organisation of the community of the realm. And what the future holds for the SNP, I don't know. It is unlikely to disappear, it may be damaged, but how we reconcile it, me as a member of the party with the rest of the movement, that's in the future. Right now, I don't want the movement to be tarred by the brush that we're seeing day and day and daily. This is a wonderful day. There's been no arrests today.
Our next question is from Miguel, and I'll pose it to yourself, Alex. You might well ask me for the answer, but about the wee ALBA book. Will it ever be published in different languages to appeal to immigrants and new Scots?
Yes. Maybe, we have to think about the maybe aspects, because I think it's really important to demonstrate two things. One, to demonstrate that you care about everybody that comes to our country and wants to contribute to it, and secondly, that you want to get across to as many folk as possible. We're not going to a political environment, remember. People haven't really taken in the fact that the Westminster elections, or any Westminster by-election, is going to require the new identification. And the statistics that tell you that in some ethnic communities, up to 35% of women don't have that identification at the present moment. A couple of weeks ago in Cope Bridge, a guy said to me, why isn't the Scottish Government pushing out that identification, to make sure that people don't get disenfranchised? And incidentally, you can actually get identification from the Electoral Commission, but people don't know that. So you're in a situation where you're going to have to communicate to lots of people, even to get them the right to vote, never mind the incentive to vote. And one way to do that is to do it in their native language, native tongue. So ALBA publications will be in a range of languages. And then we have to think of what is a key thing for everybody in this hall to understand. There are many differences with our neighbours in the south. Many similarities, of course, many commonalities. But one of the key differences has been, and we should be proud of it, is our attitude to immigration. People say, why the Scots are, generally speaking, more liberal about immigration than some of our colleagues in the south. And I think it's actually because there's no Scottish family that doesn't have immigrants in Australia or America or South Africa or Canada. And if you know from your immediate family circle what a contribution and what a success these economic migrants in the main made to all of these countries, you tend to be more sympathetic. You tend to have a different attitude. I think that's one reason. There's no reason as well. You'd have to have your head screwed up the back not to understand that Scotland's key economic challenge at the present moment is not immigration, but emigration. The loss of skills and talent and ability. We had a good period for 20 years where at last the Registrar General was forecasting the Scottish population to increase. That's changed. It's gone back down again on the forecast, as economic growth has slowed, as people would get up and go, have got up and left. And just as you could speak to every Scottish family about the Auntie Jemina in Canada, whose family did so well and done so well, come across for a wedding or whatever, you can speak to every Scottish family about their kids and their grandkids who are not here anymore because they've gone elsewhere for opportunity. So let's understand that we, for both the human interest and indeed for our self-interest, need to communicate our message in as many tongues, as many languages, in many ways possible to articulate it in every way we can.
And the next question from Alan McAllister, I'll answer because Alan's asking, the membership of ALBA. But Alan, you'll forgive me because ALBA has our conference next month on the 13th of May in Inverness, and if you don't mind, I'm going to save that wee announcement for then. I'm sure you'll understand why, but I want to make sure the membership get the information first. The next question, the question doesn't want the name read out, but this is about wind farms, and the question is, we're moving a bit more into policy now, and this is the last couple of questions I've got here, so please think in the audience if you've got any questions you'd like to ask from the floor. But in independent Scotland, would we be able to take back control of all of the wind farms where the cables go south? Alex?
Yes. If you've worked out the policy of how to do it. If you've looked across the North Sea to see the model of how to handle resource, how you chart it for Scottish circumstances. You know, some of you might know I'm an economist by trade. I try to admit that as little as possible, incidentally. I've been keeping it quiet for many years. What you're actually trying to do, to take this enormous resource and make it work for the country, is you're trying to arrive at a situation where you sell your own electricity to your own people at marginal cost. That means the cost of producing an extra kilowatt of electricity. And you sell it to everybody else at average cost, which is what constitutes the production cost and profit in each field. And if you do that, then not only will that woman in Dice be able to take her coat off on a Saturday afternoon because she'll be able to afford her electricity bill, which would be a benefit to us all, and we'd feel better about ourselves, because I've been worried about that ever since, as we'll all have examples of that just now. But also, every energy-intensive company in this land will have an advantage, a comparative advantage of cheap, renewable, green, clean power to give them an advantage over their competition. And furthermore, there'll be companies which want to come to Scotland to take advantage of that cheap, clean, renewable power. That's why it's a decisive economic advantage, as well as a social advantage for the people. And it can be done if you've worked out how to do it and offer that plan to the people for endorsement.
Jim, the second part of the question is about an independent Scotland and a policy on council tax in particular. But the question is, what would an independent Scotland do to replace council tax? I suppose it's an opportunity to discuss the different opportunities that will be available to Scotland relative to council taxation in general. And I suppose the background work, what you've been advocating, an independence organisation, umbrella organisation, independence convention can talk about how we can think about what taxation could like in independent Scotland. Jim?
Well, I don't know what we'll do until we're independent. We can say what we would like to be done, but it's not the same thing as it will actually be done. I think that this is something that the movement will have to come to a conclusion on in that body of policy I talked about earlier that we can take out to the people. But far more important, because there's running parallel to the wind is gas and oil. Can I ask a question? Can somebody tell me what the metric ton capacity is of the Earth's atmosphere? Or, a second question, can anybody tell me the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere at the present time? 79%. Somebody said loads, right? The Earth's atmosphere is 5.5 trillion metric tons. And a trillion is 1 and 15 nothing multiplied by 5.5. And the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere is 0.001%. That's it. And that will come as a great surprise to everybody, because you think we're living under a great big black cloud of CO2, and we're not. But because people don't know, and there's been propaganda about that black cloud, we have been pushed to the sidelines in the examination of the major resource that's there in the North Sea and west of Shetland in the Cairnfield, which BP describe as a giant bumper field. They'll produce oil for the next 40 or 50 years. And in the world economy, every economist who is truthful says that oil will continue to be used for its present purposes, which we all understand, but also because there are 6,000 products, quite important products, depend upon the derivative from the oil industry. And the reason I'm talking about the oil industry, and the reason I'm going to argue that we need to keep talking about it, is that when we create a new independent Scotland, we've got to lift our economy from the pits it's in at the moment, and we'll need capital for that purpose. Right now, we don't own a cupful of the black stuff. When they come to write the history of Scotland in 100 years' time, if this generation doesn't do something about it, then we truly will be, in world terms, the softest of the family. No question about it. The black stuff, not the taxation, the black stuff is where the wealth is that's passing us by at the present time. And a good part of that has to be captured for the use for the Scottish economy, for capital, and also, as Alex says, as a source of cheap energy. How do you do it? Well, I worked in the Arab world for a long time. And the Arabs started off, they were the softest of the family. Kuwait used to get 6 p a barrel for their oil, and they thought they were doing well. Then they sent their wains to get educated. And the more educated they became, they said, no, we'll have 20%, now we'll have 30%. And in Saudi Arabia, they said, no, we'll have 100%. Now, we might not be in the same position as Saudi Arabia was at that time. But if we put a wellhead tax on oil, then we own some of the black stuff, 15, 20, 30%. We would then have the capital required to reconstitute the structure of the Scottish economy. And there's more to it than just simply the black stuff. The Cairnfield isn't in the North Sea. It's in the Atlantic, which is much more difficult to get oil out of. So the opportunity for technological development in the world's oil industry is there, but it's not happening here. It's probably, again, happening in Texas. We really have to not allow ourselves to be greenwashed away from ignoring what is probably the greatest resource available at the present time, because unlike the wind, it's always there.
One of the joys, of course, of having the Independence Convention is Jim and I will be able to debate this issue. But one of the greatest regrets of my life, and hopefully we can redress this over the next immediate future. In 2007, we could have had the world's first commercial hydrogen power station at Peterhead, which then, would have been producing now for, 16 years. And would have been the wonder of the world by taking methane and turning it into carbon dioxide and hydrogen, taking the carbon dioxide and re-exporting it through the Miller line back from whence it came. See, I look at things and say, well, I think there is logic in the climate emergency. I think it is, because I passed the first Climate Change Act. The reason the Climate Change Act was passed by the Scottish Parliament in 2009, incidentally, It was when the Devolution Act was written back in 1997, climate change wasn't considered important enough to be reserved. So it wasn't reserved, therefore it was devolved, therefore in 2009, I sort of seized the opportunity to pass the most adventurous legislation in the world. And I did that because I actually believe there is a climate emergency. But I also believe there are technical ways to address it. And one of these ways is carbon capture. And if carbon capture works anywhere in the world, it'll work in the saline aquifers of the North Sea. That's where it will work. And how do we know it's going to work? Because we've done it. We've re-injected carbon into oil and gas fields to bring more oil and gas out, and it hasn't escaped. And therefore, there's no reason to suppose they cannot be a reservoir for carbon, a carbon capture reservoir. So that's, we still have that comparative advantage. 80 billion pounds is what Jeremy Hunt is expecting from his, which is a marvellous trick. I mean, I'm going to give it to the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the UK Treasury, because it was only in 2014 they told us there was nothing left. And now, lo and behold, in 2023, over the next 8 years, they're expecting £80 billion extra from their windfall taxation. That is a major conjuring trick in terms of creating wealth that apparently didn't exist just in 2014. But the biggest conjuring trick is the conjuring trick in the Scottish people. And the biggest regret is that the Acorn project is there waiting to go at St Fergus, which will establish whether I'm right and the scientists I know are right that carbon capture is possible in the North Sea, because that again would give us a huge comparative advantage that our oil industry could genuinely clean itself up and be compatible with the future of the planet.
Now we've got time briefly for any questions from the floor in the last 2 minutes we've got. Yeah, so lady in the green shirt first of all. And there's a mic coming to you. If you say your name if you wish, and your question.
I'd like to know your opinions on the upcoming policies, the invasive policies of the low emission zones. There's some in Dundee, the 20-minute cities that are coming to Edinburgh, and the digital IDs that are rolling out are all over Scotland.
Okay, thank you. And then the gentleman behind you,
Yeah, a couple of things I'd like to ask. First of all, you mentioned Lord Frost. Do you think his intervention was a tactical aspect, a sort of a kite flying to try and get the debate about whether or not the powers of devolution are adequate or not, rather than talking about independence? And can I ask you as well, Alex, you are a betting man. You talked about the Govan by-election in 1988. Do you think that there'll be one for the Scottish Parliament in 2023?
Any more questions? That's our two just now. Right, okay. Right, so, well, we'll go with you first, Alex. Which one you want to go for?
Well, let's take the last one first. And I hope Hamza takes a glance at Independence Live tonight. And I just say to him, it's not the wisest thing in the world to answer or try to answer every question that's asked you. Silence is an underrated quality in politics. And Hamza needs to learn that in terms of how he's addressing a variety of sensitive questions at the present moment. So with your pardon, because I'm not just speaking to you privately, I'm speaking for Independence Live. There are thousands of folk watching. In terms of the emission zones, the thing about things like that, you really need to keep it simple. If you want to actually achieve something in terms of a policy determination, you have to keep it simple. And I say this because, I'm very conscious of these things, right? But I don't know where the emission zone is in Aberdeen at the present moment. I don't know where it starts and where it stops. I see the occasional sign. And if I don't know, I think, there's a fair number of folk probably don't know either. Now, keep it simple to me in terms of transport is to get as much electrification done as possible. Carnegie was an extraordinary man, and he had his Highland outpost that he built What he did was he was trying to stop the First World War, you see. And so he built Skibo. And he invited all the crowned heads of Europe, you know, the Tsar and the Kaiser and everybody there, and tried to tell them, for goodness sake, don't go to war, because I know what a technological war will be like. And he failed, but it was a great enterprise. But when he built Skibo, he brought across 12 electric taxis from Chicago, because he owned the Chicago Electric Taxi Company. And these electric taxis back in 1908, 9, 10 worked fine in Chicago. They didn't work so well in Skibo. They all blew up. And the reason they blew up, because it was powered by hydroelectricity, direct current instead of alternate current, and they didn't fully understand that when they were reading the electric car. But my point is this: if you could have electric taxis in Chicago in 1908, 1909, owned by Andrew Carnegie, then certainly the advances we've seen recently in electric car technology should be much, much greater, much, much faster, and the availability and charging potential should be much greater, much quicker. So to me, emissions is quite simple. Get your transport on to clean electricity, and then you won't have to worry about whether you're in an emission zone or what zone or whatever zone you're in. That's how to tackle it, because I worry greatly about policies which are so detailed and so complex that they sound good and perhaps are good, but if people don't understand when they're in one and when they're out of one, they're not going to work.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to answer the Frost intervention, because obviously you talked about the importance of reading the Tory graph, etc. So do you think Sir David Frost's intervention was tactful to get a feel for the response he might get from the public?
No, there have been two bodies of opinion south of the border ever since 2014. One group thinks that the only way to tackle Scottish independence is a quasi-federal relationship. And in fact, Lord Lisvane, who was the former head clerk of the House of Commons, along with a reform group down there, published a new Act of Union bill in the House of Lords in 2018. It wasn't meant to become an act, it was meant to float the idea of a kind of federal relationship where the Scots would have control of everything except defence and foreign affairs. That was the sort of extreme one, but there's other people have been arguing a kind of Devo Max as the answer to Scottish nationalism. The other side is the Frost side, where to some extent you get the idea that there's a detestation of Scottish nationalism that goes beyond just disagreeing with it. And there's almost, at the moment, almost a glee among the Frost-type people at what's happening in Scotland at the present time. As Alex said, you know, they're now laughing, you know, happily. You can just imagine what the dining rooms are like this weekend coming in London as they discuss the SNP. So those are the two bodies. I don't think the Frost one is one that we should worry about at all, because we'll decide what happens to us, no Mr. Frost. I think the greatest danger, if we got up and we were 54% in the polls, then I think the Devo Max would come out. You know, what David Martin, who was the former Labour MEP in Brussels, wrote an article in one of the Labour Party newspapers or periodicals, Independence Within the UK. Get everything you want except foreign affairs and defence and maybe a couple of other things, but you'll be independent within the UK. So I think we have to think ahead at the various scenarios that we might be presented with, and that's one of them. And we have to, you know, think about that, how we attack it, how we prove that sovereignty is far better than even a federal situation, and have it there ready to use if that becomes the case. Far more important for us, I think, is to think of winning. Alex, quite right. If we can't think of winning, well, you know, I used to be an Ayr United supporter. It's very difficult to think of winning all the time. But the movement has to think of winning. And one of the, I mentioned earlier about why I would like a big vote because of what kind of Scotland. But actually the negotiations, after we win the vote, you're not independent the day after. There's a period when you negotiate, because we'll have to negotiate the division of this, that, the next thing, trade relations and all the rest of it. So we should actually start preparing now, quite privately, for what our negotiating brief is. I mean, for example, we know that England's economy is important to us because it's one of our biggest markets. How important are we to them? That'll determine the mental attitudes on either side of the table. What are our red lines that we would not concede an inch from? What's the other side's red lines that you know they won't concede an inch from? We've got to prepare that now, as well as preparing the policy to go out and campaign. So Frost, I don't worry about Frost. You know, he's talking to the south. He's not talking to us. If he ever talks to us, he's shouting at us, and I just simply ignore him. The other people are much more dangerous to the independence movement because they're bringing up something that looks pretty good, and we've got to be able to say, no, 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 it doesn't compare with the freedom that comes from being totally sovereign, because independence is about sovereignty.
I'm going to bring Alex in before we move to closing remarks, Jim, so just to give you a couple of moments to prepare them. But Alex, was Sir David Frost being sleeker or even more sleeker than usual in his remarks?
Well, it's definitely sleeker. In fact, I'd go further. I would say he was a sleeker scunner, absolutely. But I think in a few minutes' time, you're going to get the opportunity to, I think there's an auction for a book, a brilliant book by Owen Dudley Edwards on Scottish nationalism. It was published last year. Owen Dudley Edwards, the historian, long-standing figure in the national movement, and a brilliant, brilliant writer. And I thought I knew a fair bit about Scottish nationalism. I know, for example, that independence in the UK was first coined, if I remember correctly, by Donald Dewar in response to Jim's victory in the Govan by-election. So I'm interested in, even though I share Jim's opinion on Lord David Frost and Michael Gove and people like that, who are interested basically in assimilation. I mean, that's what it is. And the reason I mentioned Owen Dudley Edwards' book is one of the things I didn't know that's in Owen's book is he describes in great detail his research about the policy and attitude of James VI of Scotland, James I of England, who became King of Great Britain and set about a policy of trying to amalgamate his two kingdoms. He had the competition, of course, for the Union flag. That's why it's sometimes called the Union Jack, because it was a naval flag, because the two parliaments didn't want it. So he said, we'll have it for the King's Navy. That was the competition, that's where it came from. But what's in Owen's book, which is why I commend it to you if it's coming up for auction, is he describes that James, who was a highly educated, I can safely say the most educated monarch ever to assume the throne, he employed William Shakespeare in a quite deliberate, according to Owen's account, attempt to get over these pesky identities of Scotland and England and have a great British identity to take its place. And he describes in great detail the various moves that the king made to try and achieve this, and employing the genius of Shakespeare to aid and abet him. And I only mention this partly to help sell the book, but also to think about it this way. If James VI, the most educated monarch to assume the throne, and William Shakespeare, the genius of playwriting of history, if they couldn't pull off the assimilation of Scotland into Greater England, then I don't think we've got too much to worry about from David Frost or Michael Gove.
Thank you, Alex. That's been a good hour and a half from you both. Thank you very much. But I'd like to give the opportunity briefly, because we're going to lose our live stream shortly. Jim, some closing remarks from you, please.
About 3 weeks ago, I was asked by somebody, "How are you feeling?" And "You're looking great," he said. I said, "Well, I'm suffering from a split personality." And he said, "Whoa." I said, "Yep. On my family side, I've got a daughter, 2 stepdaughters and a son who look after me very well. See the grandchildren, they look after me very well." I said, "So on that side, very happy." I said, "See, in the public side, I'm in utter despair." And I have been right up until things began to go wrong for the party of which I am a member. Because I've always known that as long as the duo were in control, and I say this quite deliberately, as long as the duo were in control, the independence movement was going nowhere. So I'm no split any longer. When the movement was at a very low ebb after the 1975 referendum, in the early 80s, I wrote a book called The Case for Optimism. And a lot of folk thought, "What you're writing that for? Nobody's optimistic." But it did have an effect. And after tonight, because I am now very optimistic, because what I was worried about was that the drive and the energy and the willpower of the independence movement was being sapped away over the last 6 years. Tonight, and other meetings that Alex told me about, shows that isn't true. I can't say I'll write another book on optimism, but I'm sitting down in a very optimistic frame of mind.
As I said at the beginning, this is the 53rd meeting of the Wee ALBA book in the year around Scotland. And there have been some highlights of these 53 meetings. I mean, every one has been different, it's been interesting, there's been memorable contributions and questions and all the rest of it. But I actually can't think of one that's been more memorable than me having the great pleasure of listening to my old comrade Jim Sillars this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic. I think there is a case for optimism, but it's also a case for urgency. I mean, the crisis in the leading party of independence is very manifest and very clear. The pathway ahead, I mean, you know, seldom in life or politics or anything else, there's one strategy that's so predominant. But you can see the way towards what we have to do. You know, we do have to get that body of work coordinated that Jim has been speaking about. We do have to see the Scottish Government up its game very, very substantially, and that should be a preoccupation of those who have been charged with that responsibility. And we have to find a way of getting into the electoral contest with a chance of taking Scotland's case forward, not seeing it go backwards. Now, I can't speak for the range of wonderful organisations in the national movement. I can only speak for this one, ALBA. And what I can say tonight is whatever needs to be done to bring about these three objectives, to see the coordination of the national movement, to give it that life and autonomy beyond the day-to-day rigours of electoral politics, we will do. If we can help, we will help. We'll put our shoulder to the wheel. And in terms of the electoral side, whatever compromises have to be made, as long as there's no compromise on independence for Scotland, then we'll do that as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. And for the purposes of live streaming, so we can let the wonderful Gary and Stuart go, we're going to bring tonight's proceedings to an end with a huge thank you to Alex Salmond and Jim Sillars. Please join me. A huge thanks to Denise Finlay for organising this evening's event. Even more popular than the speakers by the sound of that applause. And of course, a big thank you for all of those watching us on Indie Live stream. Thank you. Please support Indie Live and keep them going. Thank you very much indeed to Gary and Stuart.
A vote of thanks to the chair.
To switch the camera off because the people at home won't be able to bid for what I'm about to talk about, and that would be